It was Halloween, and the engines had enjoyed celebrating the holiday, seeing the fireworks and the children trick-or-treating up and down the streets in their costumes. Traditionally, Edward would tell the engines one of his scary stories, but this year he was away at the works being repaired. "Who should tell the scary story this year?" asked Duck. "I have the perfect story for tonight," replied James. "A long time ago," he began, "there was a brave blue engine who was always eager to help. One night he puffed into the shed when the yard manager came to see him. 'Blue engine, could you go to the end of the line and collect a coach that was left behind today?' The brave eager engine replied, 'Of course,' and he puffed away into the fog. But by the time he made it to the end of the line, it was getting late, and the fog was getting thicker and thicker. 'I'll just have to wait until morning,' he said to himself, and he found an old shed to sleep in. Late that night, after just getting off to sleep, he was woken up by a strange scratching noise. 'Blue engine, blue engine.' The engine saw the figure looking towards him. 'Hello?' asked the engine. Then the figure stomped towards him, still saying, 'Blue engine, blue engine.' The engine raced away, shouting, 'Monster!' as the figure was now chasing after him. But the blue engine kept on racing through the fog. Then what happened?" asked Percy timidly. "That was it. The engine was never seen again. Only the coach at the end of the line made it back to tell the tale." But the monster!" Gordon chuckled. "Silly Percy, it's just a story." "Or is it?" questioned James. "But what if it's true? What if that monster is still out there chasing engines even as we speak?" "Stop being such a scaredy engine, Percy. There is no such thing as monsters." "Hoo-hoo!" laughed Duck. "Says the tank engine who thought the ghost engine at the smelters was after him." "Be quiet, Duck." As the engines settled themselves into their sheds, Percy was startled by a terrible noise. "It's the monster!" shouted Percy. "Thomas, Gordon, Duck, Henry, James, help!" "Silly Percy," laughed James. "Scared by an engine shunting a few trucks of scrap." And he laughed and laughed. Percy felt embarrassed. "Don't worry, Percy," yawned Duck. "Sometimes good imaginations think bad thoughts." The engines all went back to sleep, but while Percy was snoozing, he woke up hearing another noise. "Stop it, James!" he hissed, but James was nowhere to be seen. He was away at the smelter's yard delivering his scrap. Poor Percy began to feel scared again. If it's not James, then there is a monster under my shed," he thought, and he stayed awake for the rest of the night. Percy was very tired the next morning. "Did any of you hear any strange noises last night?" he asked sleepily. "I don't think I did," replied Duck. "Only the one from James's prank," added Thomas. "Oh, then I stayed up all night over nothing." "It's what I said, Percy. There's no such thing as monsters." "Or ghosts," added Doug cheekily. "Take it from Thomas, who thought you were a ghost," he teased. Thomas hissed steam and puffed away, but poor Percy was still tired. By the middle of the day, he was very sleepy and was falling far behind on his jobs. The Fat Controller wasn't pleased at all by this. "Tonight, Percy, I want you to stay asleep. Understand?" "Yes, sir," yawned Percy. Just then, James passed by with the express. "Monster keeping you up at night?" he teased. Percy carried on with his work, albeit still behind schedule. As the sun set, Percy puffed to the sheds. James was telling more stories, but Percy headed to his berth. he went straight to sleep. That night he was sleeping soundly in his shed when... The noise! It's back! Who's there? He whispered. Then he heard some hissing noises. Percy started to shiver. Help! Help! Whispered Percy. He tried to call for his friends, but he was scared of being too loud and angering the monster. Then he heard the door thumping. This woke James up. Percy, stop that noise, he yawned. It's not me. It's the monster. What monster? Your one. It's trying to get in. Then suddenly the thumping stopped. Percy was too frightened to move. And there, outside of the berth, were two glowing yellow eyes. James saw it too, and even he was frightened by the sight. Help! They both screamed. All the engines jumped from the noise. Save us from the monster! Then they heard laughter. Duck was the first to talk. Percy! James, he said, laughing. That's no monster. Then what is it? Snapped Percy crossly. We have no time for games, Duck, replied James huffily. Why don't you have a look and see? So they did, and Percy gasped. A hedgehog? All the engines laughed, including Percy, but James felt very embarrassed. Percy went back to sleep with the hedgehog sleeping in his cab. Next morning the hedgehog was released back into the wild, and James apologized to Percy for scaring him. I'm sorry for scaring you, Percy. It's alright, James. Thank you. Like I said, Percy, a good imagination can lead to bad thoughts. I think you're right, agreed Percy. It's the only thing in the world that could turn a tiny hedgehog into a big scary monster.
Ha 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 ha!